"Oh my God, are you all right?" The man's voice was calm but genuinely concerned. Nina tried to open her eyes. Her stomach twisted painfully. She realized she couldn't remember the last real meal she had eaten. A hand steadied her shoulder. "Easy," the man said. Nina blinked again. Her vision cleared just enough for her to realize she was leaning against someone. Someone tall, very tall. The scent of expensive cologne and winter air surrounded her. Across the ballroom, whispers began spreading like ripples across water. "That's Victor Romano. The Romano shipping empire? What happened?" Before Nina could pull herself together, another voice broke through the crowd. "What the hell happened here?" Richard Dalton pushed through the guests, his face red with anger rather than concern. The restaurant manager didn't even glance at Nina. His eyes went straight to the broken champagne glasses scattered across the marble floor. "That was a $600 tray," he snapped. "Do you have any idea?" Then he saw who was holding her. His expression changed instantly. "Oh, Mr. Romano," Dalton said quickly, forcing a stiff smile. "I'm terribly sorry about this. She's one of our waitresses. Clumsy girl. I'll deal with her immediately." Victor didn't move. His arm remained steady around Nina's shoulders, holding her upright. He studied her face instead. Up close, the exhaustion was impossible to hide. Nina tried to stand straight. "I'm sorry," she whispered weakly. "I didn't mean to drop the tray." Her voice sounded thin, embarrassed. Victor didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze moved slowly downward. Something small had slipped from the pocket of Nina's apron when she collapsed. A folded piece of paper lay on the marble floor between the broken glass. Victor bent down and picked it up. Nina saw the paper in his hand. Her heart stopped. "No, please." Her hand reached out instinctively, but she was too slow. Victor had already unfolded it. It wasn't an official document, just a sheet of restaurant notepad paper with several handwritten lines. "Broken glass, $200 deduction. Uniform cleaning, $120. Inventory mistake, $400. Late arrival, $80. Wine bottle loss, $900. Service penalties, $1,160. The list continued, each line written in the same impatient handwriting. At the bottom was the final total, $7,860 owed. Below that sat a bold signature, Richard Dalton. Victor looked up slowly. Dalton froze when he saw the paper in Victor's hand. "Oh, that," Dalton said quickly, laughing awkwardly. "Just employee accounting. Standard restaurant policy." Victor said nothing. He looked back at the paper, then at Nina. Her face had gone pale. Victor noticed the details. Burn marks dotted her fingers. Her hands trembled like someone who had been carrying heavy trays for too many hours. "How long has she been working tonight?" Victor asked quietly. Dalton hesitated. "Well, our staff works long shifts during events, but—" Victor interrupted without raising his voice. "How long?" Dalton cleared his throat. "About 18 hours, I suppose." Several guests nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks. Victor folded the paper carefully. Then he looked directly at Nina. "You owe nearly $8,000 to your manager?" he asked calmly. Nina swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry as sand. "Yes," she whispered. Victor turned his gaze toward Dalton. "And this," he said slowly, holding up the paper, "is your signature." Dalton shifted uncomfortably. "Like I said, sir, accounting. Staff damages things, we deduct it. That's business." Victor's eyes darkened slightly. He looked again at Nina. Her knees were still weak. For a moment, the powerful man simply observed her. Then he asked a quiet question, one that sounded simple. But in the silence of the ballroom, it carried unexpected weight. "Tell me something," Victor said. Nina forced herself to look up. Their eyes met. Victor held the paper between two fingers and asked, "Why does a waitress owe her manager nearly $8,000? Her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. "It's my responsibility," she said quietly. Richard Dalton nodded quickly beside them. "Exactly," Dalton added with forced confidence. "Employee damages and deductions." She signed the agreement when she started working for us. Victor Romano didn't immediately look at Dalton. Instead, his attention remained on Nina. Her voice had been calm, but her eyes told a different story. They carried the dull exhaustion of someone who had spent too many nights worrying about money that never seemed to stretch far enough. Victor had spent most of his life learning to read people. Fear, desperation, shame. Nina Carter carried all three. Dalton continued talking nervously, eager to regain control of the situation. These events are expensive to run, Mr. Romano. If employees make mistakes, the business can't absorb all the losses. That's just how restaurants operate. Victor finally turned his head. Dalton fell silent immediately. The look Victor gave him wasn't loud or threatening. It was something colder, measured. Dalton suddenly felt like a man trying to explain accounting practices to a judge who had already reached a verdict. Victor folded the paper again, carefully. "How long has she worked for you?" he asked. Dalton cleared his throat. "About a year." Victor nodded slowly. "And in that year," he continued calmly, "she has accumulated nearly $8,000 in penalties." Dalton shifted his weight. "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds worse than it is. These things add up over time." Victor glanced at Nina again. Her shoulders were slumped, as if she had been carrying invisible weight for months. "Did you break $8,000 worth of glass?" Victor asked her gently. Nina shook her head immediately. "No." The word slipped out before she could stop it. Dalton's eyes flashed toward her. Nina noticed the look and immediately lowered her gaze again. "I mean, I make mistakes sometimes," she said quickly. Dalton forced another laugh. "See? She admits it herself." "See?" But Victor had already noticed the change in her voice. There was a difference between someone confessing and someone trying to survive a conversation. Victor had heard both many times. Across the ballroom, the string quartet slowly resumed playing, though the music sounded hesitant. Unsure whether the room had returned to normal yet, Victor reached down and picked up one of the fallen champagne glasses. The crystal was shattered cleanly down the side. He turned it slowly in his hand. $600 for the tray," he said calmly. Dalton nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir." Imported crystal. Victor set the broken glass on the table. "Interesting." Dalton waited. Victor looked around the ballroom. Guests had resumed quiet conversations, though many still watched the scene from a distance. Victor turned back to Dalton. "Tell me something," he said. Dalton straightened slightly. "Yes, Mr. Romano? How many trays like this would it take to reach $8,000? Dalton hesitated. Victor didn't raise his voice, but the question had the quiet precision of a blade. Dalton did the math quickly in his head. "About 13, I suppose." Victor nodded once. Then he looked at Nina. "Have you broken 13 trays of crystal in the past year?" Nina shook her head again. "No, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Victor folded his arms. "So either your employee is the most destructive waitress in Chicago," he said calmly, "or your accounting system is creative." Dalton's smile tightened. "It's not that simple." Victor tilted his head slightly. "No," he agreed. "It rarely is." For a moment, nobody spoke. Nina wished the marble floor would open beneath her feet. The longer Victor looked at the paper, the more certain she felt that her job was already gone. Dalton leaned closer toward her and muttered under his breath, "You've done enough damage tonight." Nina felt the words like a knife. Victor heard them too. His expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He turned the paper over once more. Then he placed it back into Nina's trembling hands. "Keep it," he said quietly. Nina blinked in surprise. "You'll want proof." Dalton stiffened. "Proof of what?" Victor looked at him calmly. "Of how generous your accounting practices are." Dalton forced a laugh again, but it sounded strained now. "Well, if there's nothing else," Victor interrupted him with a small gesture. "You're finished for the evening," Victor said to Nina. She stared at him. What?" "You're exhausted," he said simply. Dalton immediately stepped forward. "She can't leave. She still has 3 hours left on shift." Victor looked at him. Dalton stopped talking again. The room had grown quiet for the second time that evening. Victor reached into his jacket and removed a black card. He placed it calmly on the table beside the broken tray. "This should cover the glasses," he said. Dalton stared at the card. He knew exactly what it was. A private banking card. The kind issued only to clients whose wealth didn't require limits. "That's not necessary," Dalton said quickly. Victor met his eyes. "I insist." Dalton swallowed. "Yes, of course." Victor turned back to Nina. She still looked confused. "You should go home," he said. Nina hesitated. "But my shift." "You collapsed," Victor replied calmly. "That usually qualifies as a reason to stop working." Dalton looked like he wanted to argue, but he also looked like a man who understood that continuing this conversation might become dangerous. Nina slowly removed the apron from her waist. Her hands were still shaking. She folded it carefully and set it beside the tray. For a moment, she stood there awkwardly. Then she looked up at Victor. "Thank you," she said quietly. Victor nodded once. She turned and began walking toward the exit. Each step felt unreal. She half expected Dalton to shout at her to come back, but he didn't. When the ballroom doors closed behind her, the cool Chicago night air rushed into her lungs. For the first time that day, she could breathe. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Your messages mean a lot and help this community grow. And if you enjoy stories about courage, justice, and unexpected kindness, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Inside the ballroom, Dalton finally spoke again. "You've made a mistake interfering with my staff," he muttered. Victor picked up his glass of whiskey. "No," he said calmly. He looked at the empty doorway where Nina had disappeared. "I've made an observation." Dalton frowned. Victor took a slow sip of whiskey. "A man who keeps his employees in debt," he said quietly, "usually has something much larger to hide." Dalton's smile vanished. Across the table, Victor Romano already knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tonight had not been an accident. It had been an introduction, and the small crumpled paper in Nina Carter's pocket was only the beginning. The cold air outside the Lakefront Grand Hotel felt sharper than Nina Carter expected. Chicago nights near the lake always carried that biting wind that slipped through coats and reminded people winter was never far away. Nina pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she stepped down the hotel stairs and onto the quiet sidewalk. For a moment she simply stood there. The street lights cast long yellow reflections across the pavement. A few black sedans waited along the curb for wealthy guests finishing their evening inside. Nina looked down at her hands. They were still trembling. She wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or from what had just happened inside the ballroom. Victor Romano. The name alone felt unreal. She had seen his face in newspapers before, usually in articles about shipping companies or charity foundations. Sometimes there were rumors attached to his name too. Whispers that floated through kitchens and staff break rooms. But rumors belonged to another world. A world far above waitresses working double shifts. Yet somehow tonight, she had collapsed into his arms, and he had read that paper. Her stomach twisted again. The folded debt note was still in her hand. She hadn't even realized she had carried it outside with her. Slowly, she opened it. The numbers looked even worse beneath the streetlight. Chichen Babai Lushamayuan. Nina let out a quiet breath. That number had followed her everywhere for months. It lived in her thoughts the way unpaid bills lived in the back of every working person's mind. Every mistake, every broken plate, every missing inventory item Richard Dalton claimed she owed. At first, the deductions had been small. $30 here, $80 there. Then came the bigger ones. A bottle of imported wine that Dalton said she had dropped. $900. She hadn't dropped it, but arguing hadn't changed anything. Dalton always had the same calm response. "If you don't like the policy, Nina, you're free to find another job." Except finding another job wasn't that simple. Not when rent was due. Not when your mother's medical bills kept arriving in the mail. Not when Chicago was full of restaurants that hired people quickly but replaced them even faster. Nina folded the paper again and slipped it back into her pocket. She began walking toward the bus stop at the corner. Her legs felt weak, but the cool air was helping clear her head. Across the street, a late-night diner glowed with warm light. Inside, a few truck drivers sat at the counter, eating pancakes and eggs. For a moment, Nina thought about going in. Just a cup of coffee, maybe a slice of toast. But she checked the small wallet in her purse. $9. That had to last until payday, if Dalton didn't deduct anything else first. She kept walking. Behind her, the ballroom doors of the hotel opened again. Nina didn't notice. Inside the hotel lobby, Victor Romano stepped out of the elevator with the quiet confidence of someone used to being observed. Mateo Alvarez walked beside him. Mateo had been Victor's head of security for nearly 10 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always calm, he carried himself like a man who had seen enough trouble to recognize it before it arrived. "You stayed longer than expected," Mateo said quietly. Victor adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket. "I noticed something interesting." Mateo didn't ask immediately. Victor stopped near the glass doors overlooking the street. Outside, Nina was just reaching the bus stop. Victor nodded slightly toward the window. "The waitress?" he said. Mateo followed his gaze. Nina stood under the flickering bus stop light, rubbing her arms against the cold. She doesn't look like trouble, Matteo said. Victor watched her for a moment. No, he agreed. She looks like someone being used by trouble. Matteo crossed his arms thoughtfully. You want me to check into the manager? Victor gave a small nod. Richard Dalton. Matteo had already memorized the name from the brief moment earlier. I'll have something by morning. Victor continued watching the bus stop. The city moved quietly around them. A taxi rolled past. Wind pushed newspapers across the sidewalk. Nina shifted her weight, clearly exhausted. Victor had seen thousands of employees in restaurants, hotels, and warehouses across Chicago. Hard workers were easy to recognize. So were people who had been pushed too far. She collapsed after an 18-hour shift, Victor said calmly. Matteo raised an eyebrow. That alone would make most labor lawyers curious. Victor's voice remained calm. The deductions interest me more. Matteo understood immediately. $8,000 in penalties wasn't normal, not even in the worst kitchens. You think the manager's running something? Matteo asked. Victor turned away from the window. I think men who squeeze money from waitresses usually squeeze something else from someone bigger. Matteo smiled slightly. That sounds expensive. Victor returned the faintest hint of a smile. Most interesting things are. Outside, Nina's bus finally arrived. The old city bus pulled to the curb with a tired hiss of air brakes. Nina climbed aboard slowly, swiping her transit card before moving to the back seat. She leaned her head against the cold window. Within seconds, her eyes closed. Across the street, Victor watched the bus disappear into traffic. Matteo spoke again. You want me to leave it alone if it's small? Victor considered the question. Chicago had hundreds of small, corrupt managers. Most weren't worth his attention. But something about the numbers on that paper bothered him. Not the amount, the pattern. Look into the restaurant, Victor said. Matteo nodded. And the girl? Victor walked toward the exit. If Dalton is squeezing employees, he said, she won't be the only one. Matteo understood the instruction. Quiet investigation. No noise. No interference yet. Just information. Victor stepped outside into the cold Chicago night. The wind off Lake Michigan tugged lightly at his coat. For most of the guests leaving the charity gala, the evening would end with expensive wine and comfortable beds. But Victor Romano had just encountered a small irregularity in the city's machinery. And in his experience, small irregularities often led to very large problems. Far across the city, Nina slept lightly against the bus window as the vehicle rattled through dark streets. She had no idea that a man who controlled shipping routes, warehouses, and half the shadows in Chicago had just taken an interest in her life. And once Victor Romano became interested in something, he rarely stopped until he understood it completely. The bus ride across Chicago felt longer than usual that night. Nina Carter slept for most of it. Her head leaned against the cold window while the city lights blurred past in streaks of yellow and white. Every bump in the road stirred her slightly, but exhaustion kept pulling her back into shallow sleep. When the bus finally stopped near her neighborhood, the driver called out the street name twice before she woke up. Last stop for you, miss. Nina blinked quickly and straightened. Oh, sorry. She stood, embarrassed, and stepped off the bus into the quiet street. This part of Chicago looked nothing like the lakefront Grand Hotel. Here the sidewalks were cracked. Old brick apartment buildings leaned slightly with age. A flickering neon sign from a liquor store glowed on the corner. Nina pulled her cardigan tighter as she walked the last block toward her building. The apartment complex had once been respectable decades ago. Now the hallway lights buzzed softly and the paint peeled from the stairwell walls. Still, it was home, and it was what she could afford. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step reminding her how tired her legs still felt. By the time she unlocked the door to her small studio apartment, the clock on the microwave read 12:47 a.m. The room was quiet. A single lamp beside the couch lit the space with a soft yellow glow. Nina had left it on earlier that morning before rushing to work. She dropped her purse on the small kitchen table and sank onto the couch. For several minutes, she didn't move. Her body felt hollow. Not pain exactly, just that deep exhaustion that settled into a person's bones after too many long days. Eventually, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the folded paper again. The debt note. The numbers stared back at her. Titen Babai Loshermayuan. Dalton's signature still sat boldly at the bottom. Nina sighed and leaned back against the couch. Most people believed debt came from banks or credit cards, but sometimes it came from places like kitchens and restaurants. Sometimes it came from men like Richard Dalton. Her phone buzzed softly on the table. Nina picked it up. A text message from her mother. "Did you eat today?" Nina smiled faintly. She typed back quickly. "Yes. Busy night, but good tips." It was easier to lie. Her mother already worried too much about the hospital bills. Another message came seconds later. "Proud of you. Get some sleep." Nina placed the phone down and rubbed her eyes. She thought about Victor Romano again. The moment replayed clearly in her mind. The way he had caught her, the way he had looked at that paper. Most wealthy men barely noticed waitresses, but he had. That part unsettled her, because attention from powerful people rarely ended well for someone like her. Nina folded the paper carefully and slid it into the small drawer beside her couch. Tomorrow she would return to the restaurant, and Dalton would definitely be waiting. Across the city, in a quiet office overlooking the Chicago River, Mateo Alvarez sat in front of 3 computer screens. It was nearly 1 in the morning. For most people, the night was over. For Mateo, it was when work usually began. Information flowed faster after midnight. He sipped black coffee while scanning the documents on his screen. Restaurant, Dalton's Grill and Bar. Owner, Richard Dalton. Revenue reports, employee schedules, tax filings. Mateo frowned slightly. Something about the numbers didn't add up. The restaurant reported modest income, yet several large cash deposits appeared in the business account every month. Deposits that were far larger than normal restaurant revenue. Mateo leaned back in his chair. "That's interesting," he murmured. He opened another file. Employee records. High turnover. Very high. Most staff members stayed only a few months, but a handful had worked there longer, including Nina Carter. He clicked on her file. Age, neotuve. Position, waitress. Start date, 14 months ago. Mateo studied the payroll deductions column. His eyebrows rose slightly. $8,000, he muttered. He had seen criminal accountants hide millions through shell companies, but squeezing thousands from a waitress told a different story. Not sophisticated, just cruel. Mateo typed a quick message and sent it. Then he picked up his phone and called Victor. The call connected after 1 ring. "Yes," Victor answered. Mateo didn't waste time. "The manager's business accounts are dirty." Victor's voice remained calm. "How dirty?" "Regular cash deposits that don't match restaurant revenue." Victor paused briefly. "Organized crime?" "Looks like it," Mateo said. Victor's tone hardened slightly. "Which group?" Mateo opened another document. He read the name slowly. "Possibly connected to the O'Connor network." Victor knew the name well. The Irish syndicate controlled several smuggling operations around Chicago's west side. They had avoided direct conflict with Victor's organization for years, but money laundering through restaurants was a common tactic. Victor spoke again. "And the employees?" Mateo glanced at the payroll sheet. "Most of them owed Dalton money through deductions." Victor said nothing. Mateo understood why. Debt could be a powerful leash, especially for workers living paycheck to paycheck. Finally, Victor spoke. "What about the waitress?" Mateo glanced again at Nina's record. "She's been there longer than most." "Why?" Mateo considered the question. "Probably because she can't afford to leave." Victor walked slowly across his office floor while thinking. Outside his window, the Chicago skyline shimmered with midnight lights. "Continue digging," he said. Mateo nodded, even though Victor couldn't see him. "Understood." "And Mateo." "Yes?" Victor's voice grew quieter. "Find out exactly how Dalton calculates those deductions." Mateo smiled slightly. "Already working on it." Victor ended the call. Across the city, Nina Carter had already fallen asleep on her couch. She had no idea that the quiet man who caught her earlier that evening had just set something in motion, and that by morning, Richard Dalton's little restaurant would begin attracting attention from people far more dangerous than a tired waitress asking for a break. Morning came slowly for Nina Carter. The pale winter sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of her apartment and landed across the small living room floor. The light reached her eyes long before her alarm clock rang. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Then the memory of the previous night rushed back all at once. The gala, the shattered tray, Victor Romano, and the paper. Nina sat up on the couch and rubbed her face. Her neck felt stiff from sleeping in the same clothes she had worn to work. The clock on the microwave read 6:18 a.m. Her shift started at 7. For a moment she considered staying home. Her body still felt weak, her stomach hollow from hunger. But the thought lasted only a second. Missing a shift meant losing pay. and losing pay meant Dalton would add another deduction to the paper. She stood slowly and walked to the sink. Cold water helped wake her up. She tied her hair back and changed into a clean uniform from the small closet beside her bed. The restaurant apron hung on the back of a chair. Nina stared at it for a moment. Then she slipped it on. By 6:45, she was walking toward the bus stop again, coffee in a cheap paper cup warming her hands. Chicago mornings always felt different from nights. Delivery trucks rumbled through intersections, construction crews began their work, and the smell of bakeries drifted through the cold air. Normal life, the kind that didn't include men like Victor Romano. Nina told herself last night had been a strange accident, nothing more. Dalton's Grill and Bar sat on a busy corner 3 blocks from the river. The restaurant looked respectable from the outside, large windows, polished sign, early customers already stepping in for breakfast. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with activity. Pans clattered, coffee machines hissed. The smell of bacon filled the air. Nina stepped inside and tied her apron tighter around her waist. "Morning," she said quietly to one of the cooks. He nodded without looking up. Everyone moved quickly during the morning rush. Everyone except Richard Dalton. The manager stood near the bar counter, arms crossed, watching the staff with the same expression he used every day. The moment he saw Nina, his eyes narrowed. "Office," he said. One word. Nina's stomach tightened. She followed him through the narrow hallway toward the back office. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Dalton turned slowly. "You embarrassed me last night." His voice was calm. That always made things worse. Nina clasped her hands together. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to collapse." Dalton laughed quietly. "No, you didn't mean to collapse. You meant to make me look incompetent in front of a room full of rich clients." "That's not what happened," Nina said softly. Dalton leaned closer. "You let Romano read that paper." Nina blinked. "I didn't let him. It fell." Dalton studied her face carefully. For a moment he looked like he might explode, but instead he smiled. A thin, unpleasant smile. "Well," he said, "we'll just have to adjust your account." Nina felt the familiar weight of those words. "How much?" Dalton pulled out a small notebook from his desk. He flipped through several pages. "Broken champagne tray," he said. $600. "But he paid for it," Nina said quickly. Dalton shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The restaurant still logs the damage." Nina stared at him. "That doesn't make sense." Dalton stopped writing. His eyes lifted slowly. "Are you questioning company policy?" Nina swallowed. "No." Dalton finished writing and tore the page from his notebook. He handed it to her. "New balance, $8,460. Nina stared at the number. For a moment the room felt too small. "You can't keep doing this," she whispered. Dalton leaned back in his chair. "Of course I can." He tapped the paper with his finger. "You signed the agreement." Nina knew arguing was pointless, but something about the previous night had shifted inside her. Maybe it was the embarrassment. Maybe it was the way Victor Romano had looked at that paper like it meant something. Or maybe she was simply too tired to keep pretending everything was normal. "You know I didn't break half those things," she said quietly. Dalton's smile disappeared. "You work here because I allow it." He stood slowly. "You owe money. That means you stay until the debt is gone." Nina folded the paper carefully. "How long will that take?" she asked. Dalton shrugged. "That depends how many more mistakes you make." He opened the office door. "Now get back to work." Nina stepped out into the hallway. The sounds of the restaurant rushed back around her. Customers talking, plates clattering, coffee pouring. She tucked the new paper into her apron pocket. $8,460. Across the city, Mateo Alvarez stepped into Victor Romano's office, carrying a folder. Victor sat near the window overlooking the Chicago River, reading a financial report. Mateo placed the folder on the desk. "I found the pattern." Victor closed the report. "Explain." Mateo opened the folder. "Dalton's restaurant launders cash deposits every 2 weeks. The numbers line up with O'Connor shipments." Victor nodded slowly. "The Irish network again," Mateo continued. "But the interesting part is how he handles the staff." Victor looked up. Mateo slid a payroll sheet across the desk. "Most employees quit within 3 months. The ones who stay accumulate debt through deductions." Victor read the sheet carefully, "Meaning they can't leave." "Exactly." Victor leaned back in his chair. "Indentured labor disguised as restaurant accounting." Mateo nodded. "And the waitress?" Victor's eyes moved to the name on the file. Nina Carter. Mateo spoke calmly. She returned to work this morning. Victor looked toward the window again. The city stretched out below him in endless blocks of buildings and streets. Somewhere inside that city, Nina Carter was probably carrying trays again, still owing money she would never realistically repay. Victor stood. "Prepare the car," he said. Mateo raised an eyebrow. "You're visiting the restaurant?" Victor adjusted his coat. "I'm curious." Mateo smiled faintly. Richard Dalton had no idea what kind of curiosity he had just attracted, and curiosity from Victor Romano rarely ended quietly. The lunch crowd arrived early that day. Dalton's grill and bar filled quickly with office workers escaping their desks for an hour of food and conversation. The restaurant buzzed with movement plates sliding across counters, coffee refilling, orders shouted through the kitchen window. Nina Carter moved between tables with the steady rhythm she had learned over the past year. Take an order, refill water, smile, repeat. To anyone watching, she looked like any other waitress in Chicago. But inside, the paper in her apron pocket felt heavier than the trays she carried. The number sat in her mind like a stone. Every time she moved, she felt the corner of the folded note brushing against her hip. Her shift had started less than 2 hours earlier, and already Dalton had found 2 more things to complain about. The toast was too dark at table 4. The coffee was poured too slowly at table 7. He hadn't written anything down yet, but Nina knew the routine. By the end of the week, another deduction would appear, and the number would grow. "Order up." The cook slid 2 plates through the window. Nina grabbed them quickly. "Burger, eggs, hash browns, table 12. As she crossed the dining room, the restaurant door opened. A cold gust of wind followed the entrance of 2 men. Most customers didn't notice, but the staff did. Conversations quieted slightly. One of the bartenders straightened his posture. Even Nina felt the shift in the air before she looked up. Victor Romano walked into the restaurant as if he had all the time in the world. He wore a dark overcoat over a charcoal suit. The coat moved slightly as he walked, revealing the sharp lines of tailored fabric underneath. Mateo Alvarez followed half a step behind him. Victor's presence had a strange effect on rooms. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't demand attention, but attention always found him anyway. Nina froze for a fraction of a second when she saw him. Then she quickly continued walking toward table 12. "Don't stare. Don't get involved. Just do your job." Victor noticed her immediately. Of course he did. The exhaustion from the previous night still lingered in her face, though she had done her best to hide it. He also noticed something else. The way Dalton appeared almost instantly from the back office. "Mr. Romano," Dalton said with forced enthusiasm. "This is unexpected." Victor removed his coat calmly and handed it to Mateo. "Lunch," he said simply. Dalton laughed nervously. "Well, of course. Please, any table you like." Victor chose a table near the window, the same kind of seat businessmen often used when they wanted to watch a room without appearing to do so. Mateo sat across from him. Dalton grabbed 2 menus and rushed over. "What can I get you today?" Victor didn't open the menu. "Coffee," he said. Dalton nodded quickly. "Right away." As Dalton hurried toward the kitchen, Victor's gaze drifted across the restaurant. Employees moved quickly, customers talked, but small details stood out. A cook rubbing his wrist like it hurt, a busboy carrying 3 trays alone, and Nina Carter moving between tables with the careful precision of someone who knew every mistake had consequences. Mateo noticed Victor watching her. "She's still here," Mateo said quietly. Victor nodded. She couldn't leave even if she wanted to. Mateo understood. Debt chains were invisible, but they held people just as tightly as locks. Dalton returned with 2 cups of coffee. "Here we go." He placed them on the table and forced another smile. Victor stirred the coffee slowly. "You run a busy place." Dalton relaxed slightly. "Yes, sir. Been successful for years." Victor took a sip. "Must require strict management." Dalton chuckled. "Employees need discipline." Victor glanced toward Nina again. She was pouring coffee at table 8. Her hands moved carefully. Dalton followed his gaze. "Oh," he said quickly. "The girl from last night." Victor said nothing. Dalton leaned closer. "She's not normally that clumsy." Victor set the cup down. "How much does she owe now?" Dalton blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Victor repeated calmly. "The debt." Dalton forced a smile. "Oh, that's just internal bookkeeping." Victor leaned back in his chair. "How much?" Dalton hesitated. Then he answered, 8,460. Mateo raised one eyebrow slightly. Victor didn't react. Instead, he looked around the restaurant again. How much does she earn per week? Dalton frowned. Why is that relevant? Victor's voice remained calm. Who more me? Dalton shifted uncomfortably. About 400 with tips. Victor did the math silently. Even if Nina paid every dollar she earned, it would take more than 5 months to clear the debt. Assuming Dalton didn't add more deductions, which he would, Victor looked back at Dalton. That seems inefficient. Dalton laughed again. Business isn't always simple. Victor's expression hardened slightly. No, he said quietly. But exploitation usually is. Dalton's smile vanished. Around them, the restaurant continued its normal lunch rhythm. But at the table near the window, the air had changed. Dalton straightened his posture. Are you accusing me of something? Victor lifted his cup again. No. He took another slow sip. I'm observing. Dalton crossed his arms. Well, Mr. Romano, with all respect, how I run my staff isn't really your concern. Victor placed the cup down. For the first time, his eyes sharpened. You're right, he said calmly. It wasn't. Across the room, Nina carried another tray past their table. She tried not to listen, but every word felt like it echoed through the restaurant. Victor watched her pass. Then he returned his gaze to Dalton. But when a man builds a system where employees can never leave, Victor continued quietly, that becomes something else. Dalton's voice dropped. What exactly are you implying? Victor's expression returned to calm neutrality. Nothing. He stood slowly. Mateo followed. Victor placed several bills on the table beside the untouched menus. Thank you for the coffee. Dalton stared. You're leaving? Victor nodded. For now. He put on his coat. Before walking out, he paused beside Nina as she wiped down a nearby table. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. You should eat lunch today. Nina looked up, surprised. I'm working. Victor gave the faintest hint of a smile. That wasn't a suggestion. Then he walked toward the door. Mateo followed him outside. Dalton watched from across the room, unease creeping into his expression, because he knew one thing about men like Victor Romano. They didn't visit places twice by accident. And when they started asking questions, answers usually followed. Richard Dalton stood in the middle of the dining room long after Victor Romano left. The restaurant noise returned to normal around him. But something inside Dalton had shifted. Customers continued eating burgers and omelets. Waitresses moved between tables. The coffee machine hissed again behind the counter. Yet Dalton felt as if the room had tilted slightly. Victor Romano did not walk into restaurants for casual coffee. Men like him did not ask questions without reason. Dalton slowly walked back to the office. Inside, he closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. The small room smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and printer ink. His desk sat beneath a flickering fluorescent light, covered with payroll sheets and delivery invoices. Dalton opened the top drawer. Inside lay a second notebook. Unlike the one he carried on the floor, this one contained numbers no employee had ever seen. Cash deposits, delivery schedules, names of suppliers that never appeared on restaurant paperwork. He flipped through several pages quickly. Everything looked normal. No mistakes, no missing entries. Still, Victor Romano's quiet voice echoed in his mind. How much does she earn per week? Dalton slammed the notebook shut. That bastard, he muttered. Across the dining room, Nina Carter finished wiping table 9. Her back still felt tense from the moment Victor had spoken to her. You should eat lunch today. The words had sounded simple, almost casual, yet something about them had stayed with her. Most customers never noticed whether a waitress had eaten or not. They barely noticed waitresses at all. Hey, Nina turned. It was Carlos, one of the line cooks. He held a small plate in one hand, scrambled eggs and toast. You forgot your staff meal yesterday, he said quietly. Kitchen made extra. Nina hesitated. Dalton rarely allowed staff to eat during rush hours. Carlos noticed her hesitation. He's in the office, Carlos added with a shrug. Nina accepted the plate. Thanks. She slipped into the small break area behind the kitchen. The room was barely larger than a closet. A metal table sat against one wall with 2 chairs that didn't match. Nina sat down and stared at the food. Her stomach growled immediately. For a moment she remembered Victor standing beside her table. You should eat lunch today. She picked up the fork and began eating slowly. The warm food felt strange after so many hours of coffee and adrenaline. Outside the break room, The restaurant doors opened again. Dalton emerged from his office just in time to see Mateo Alvarez step back inside the restaurant. Mateo looked exactly the same as before, calm, controlled, polite, but this time he carried a thin folder in one hand. Dalton's chest tightened. "Can I help you?" Dalton asked. Mateo smiled politely. "Yes." He stepped closer and placed the folder on the counter. "I'm looking for some information." Dalton kept his voice steady. "What kind of information?" Mateo opened the folder slowly. Inside were several printed documents: payroll records, business registrations, cash deposit summaries. Dalton recognized them immediately. "How did you get those?" he asked. Mateo shrugged lightly. "Public records can be very educational." Dalton's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Mateo closed the folder again. "Just a conversation." Dalton leaned forward. "If Romano thinks he can come in here and threaten me." Mateo interrupted gently. "Mr. Romano hasn't threatened anyone." Dalton crossed his arms. "Then what is this?" Mateo tapped the folder once. "Curiosity." Dalton let out a sharp laugh. "You think you're going to scare me with paperwork?" Mateo's expression didn't change. "No." He leaned slightly closer across the counter. "I think the IRS might." Dalton felt a flicker of heat rise in his chest. "Listen carefully," Dalton said quietly. "This restaurant has been running fine for years. Whatever game Romano is playing." Mateo shook his head. "There's no game." Dalton frowned. Mateo continued calmly. "You built a system where employees owe you money." Dalton said nothing. Mateo opened the folder again and slid one page across the counter. "Nina Carter's payroll deductions." Dalton stared at the paper. "She signed an agreement," he said quickly. Mateo nodded. "I'm sure she did." Dalton leaned forward again. "So what's the problem?" Mateo met his eyes. "The problem," he said quietly, "is that when you combine payroll deductions with suspicious cash deposits, federal investigators start asking questions." Dalton's stomach tightened. "You wouldn't dare." Mateo smiled faintly. "Oh, I wouldn't." He closed the folder. "But someone might." Dalton stared at him. "What does Romano want?" Mateo picked up the folder. "For now?" He turned toward the door. "Nothing." Dalton's voice rose. "You come in here waving fake documents and say he wants nothing?" Mateo paused near the exit. Then he said something that made Dalton's chest tighten even further. "He wants to understand why a small restaurant manager thinks he can run a debt prison in the middle of Chicago." Dalton watched him leave. Outside, Mateo stepped onto the sidewalk where Victor Romano waited beside a black sedan. Victor glanced toward the restaurant window. "Well?" Mateo opened the car door. "He's nervous." Victor nodded slightly. "That means we're close." Across the dining room, Nina finished the last bite of her eggs. For the first time in days, she felt a small amount of strength return to her body. She had no idea that a quiet war had just begun around her, and that by the end of it, the small paper in her apron pocket might bring down far more than a restaurant manager. The rest of the afternoon passed with an uneasy quiet inside Dalton's Grill and Bar. Customers came and went as usual, but the tension among the staff felt different. Nina could sense it even while carrying plates and refilling coffee. Dalton was watching everyone. He moved through the restaurant with sharper eyes than usual, stopping beside the register, checking the kitchen window, scanning the dining room as if expecting trouble to walk through the door. Twice Nina caught him staring at her, not with his usual irritation, with calculation. It made her stomach tighten. By the time the evening shift began, the sky outside had turned dark blue, and the neon signs along the street flickered to life. The dinner crowd arrived slower than lunch, but the restaurant still filled with conversations and clinking glasses. Nina carried a tray of drinks to table 6 and tried to focus on the routine of her job. Smile, set the glasses down, write the order, move to the next table, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mateo's visit earlier. She had only seen a small part of that conversation from across the room, yet she could tell Dalton had been shaken. No one had ever spoken to Dalton like that before. Not customers, not employees, certainly not people who looked calm while doing it. Something had changed, and Nina didn't understand what it meant yet. Inside the office, Dalton slammed the door shut. His hands shook slightly as he grabbed the phone from his desk. He dialed a number quickly. The call connected after 2 rings. "You told me Romano wouldn't interfere," Dalton snapped. A deep voice answered on the other end. "We said he usually doesn't." Dalton paced the office. "Well, he is now." Silence followed for a moment. Then the voice spoke again. What did he ask? Dalton ran a hand through his hair. Questions about the staff, about the money. The man on the phone exhaled slowly. That's not good. Dalton stopped pacing. I need this handled. Another pause. Then the voice replied, We'll talk tonight. The call ended. Dalton stared at the phone for a moment before placing it down. His eyes drifted toward the dining room through the office window. Nina moved between tables, carrying another tray. Dalton's expression hardened. This is your fault, he muttered. Across town, Victor Romano sat inside the back room of a quiet Italian restaurant near the river. The restaurant belonged to an old friend, and the staff knew better than to disturb him when he used the room. Matteo sat across from him at the small wooden table. Between them lay several documents, financial reports, shipping manifests, bank records. Matteo tapped one page with his finger. The deposits match the O'Connor network shipments, he said. Victor studied the paper carefully. The Irish syndicate had been operating quietly in Chicago for years. They moved goods through small businesses, bars, garages, restaurants. Dalton's Grill was one of those businesses, a convenient place to wash dirty money through daily sales. Victor leaned back in his chair. Dalton called them tonight. Matteo nodded. We expected that. Victor picked up his glass of red wine. When cornered, men like Dalton look for protection. Matteo smiled slightly. And protection always has a price. Victor's voice remained calm. Yes. He set the glass down. The question is whether the O'Connors consider him worth protecting. Matteo thought about that. A restaurant manager isn't exactly valuable. Victor shook his head. No. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the dark river. But secrets can be. Matteo understood immediately. Dalton didn't just manage a restaurant. He managed the books. If investigators looked too closely, the Irish syndicate could lose far more than one small business. Victor turned back toward the table. Continue monitoring the restaurant tonight. Matteo nodded. And the waitress? Victor paused. Nina Carter had entered the situation accidentally, yet somehow she had become the center of it. She's still working, Matteo added. Victor considered that. Then he said quietly, Dalton will try to remove the problem. Matteo frowned. You think he'll fire her? Victor shook his head slowly. No. His voice lowered slightly. I think he'll try something worse. Back at the restaurant, the dinner rush had finally slowed. Nina wiped down the counter near the register while the last few customers finished their meals. Her feet ached. But at least Dalton had stayed in the office most of the evening. For now, she grabbed a rag and turned toward the hallway. The office door opened suddenly. Dalton stepped out. Nina, he said. His tone sounded strangely calm. Too calm. Yes. Come with me. Her stomach tightened again. She followed him down the hallway toward the back door of the restaurant. Cold night air slipped inside as Dalton opened it. Take out the trash, he said. He handed her a large black bag. Nina hesitated. That's not usually my... Dalton cut her off. Are you refusing work? No, she said quickly. She grabbed the bag. The alley behind the restaurant was dark except for a single yellow light above the back door. Dumpsters lined the brick wall. Nina walked toward them slowly. The cold wind rustled loose paper across the ground. She lifted the dumpster lid and tossed the bag inside. The metal lid slammed shut with a loud clang. At that exact moment, headlights appeared at the end of the alley. A black sedan rolled slowly toward the back entrance of the restaurant. Nina stepped aside instinctively. The car stopped. The passenger door opened. Matteo Alvarez stepped out. Nina blinked in surprise. Good evening, Matteo said calmly. She stared at him. Is everything okay? Matteo glanced briefly toward the restaurant door behind her. Then he looked back at Nina. That depends, he said. On what? Matteo nodded toward the sedan. Victor Romano sat inside, watching quietly through the window. Matteo spoke softly. On whether you're ready to hear the truth about the man you work for. Nina's heart began beating faster, because for the first time, she realized the situation surrounding her job might be far more dangerous than unpaid wages, and the night was far from over. The cold wind in the alley carried the smell of rain and old grease from the dumpsters. Nina Carter stood frozen beside the metal container, staring at Matteo Alvarez. Behind him, the black sedan idled quietly, its headlights cutting a pale path across the cracked pavement. Inside the car, Victor Romano watched her calmly. For a moment, Nina didn't know what to say. Nothing about this situation felt normal. You said, the truth about Dalton? She asked cautiously. Matteo nodded. Yes. Nina glanced toward the restaurant door behind her. Through the small window, she could see shadows moving inside the kitchen. The staff was finishing cleanup for the night. Dalton could walk out at any moment. What kind of truth? She asked. Matteo stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. The kind that explains why a restaurant manager keeps his employees in permanent debt. Nina crossed her arms against the cold. He says it's company policy. Matteo gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. Of course he does. He opened the rear car door. Victor Romano stepped out. The alley seemed to grow quieter the moment he did. Victor buttoned his coat and walked toward Nina with the same steady calm she remembered from the gala. Up close, his presence felt strangely reassuring. "Miss Carter," he said. Nina nodded awkwardly. "Mr. Romano." Victor glanced toward the restaurant door before speaking again. "You've worked here over a year." "Yes. And your debt keeps growing." Nina sighed softly. "That's how it works." Victor studied her face. "No," he said quietly. "That's how Dalton makes it work." Nina frowned. "What do you mean?" "What?" Matteo handed Victor the folder he had brought earlier. Victor opened it and pulled out a single sheet. Bank transactions, cash deposits, delivery schedules. He held the paper where Nina could see it. "Your manager launders money through this restaurant," Victor said calmly. Nina blinked. "That's impossible." Victor shook his head. "It's very common." Matteo spoke next. "Restaurants move cash every day. It's easy to hide illegal money inside normal business." Nina stared at the paper. "You're saying Dalton is—" "What? Some kind of criminal?" Victor answered simply. "He works for the O'Connor Syndicate." The name meant nothing to Nina, but the seriousness in his voice made her uneasy. "So what does that have to do with me?" she asked. Victor folded the document again. "Everything." Before he could explain further, the restaurant door slammed open behind them. Dalton stepped into the alley. His eyes moved instantly between Nina, Matteo, and Victor. "So this is the little meeting," he said coldly. Nina's heart dropped. Dalton walked toward them slowly. "I was wondering how long it would take for you to start talking to her," he said to Victor. Victor didn't move. Dalton laughed under his breath. "You think you're the first man to stick his nose into someone else's business?" Victor answered calmly. "No." Dalton stopped a few feet away. "But you might be the last," Dalton replied. He reached into his jacket. Nina froze. For a split second, she thought he might pull out another notebook. Instead, Dalton drew a handgun. The metal glinted under the alley light. Nina's breath caught in her throat. "You should have left my restaurant alone," Dalton said. Matteo moved slightly to the side, positioning himself between Dalton and Victor. Victor remained perfectly calm. "Do you really think this helps your situation?" Victor asked. Dalton's hand trembled slightly, but he kept the gun raised. "You already ruined my situation." Sirens echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. Dalton glanced toward the street. "You don't understand," he said bitterly. "If Romano starts digging into my books, the O'Connors will bury me." Victor's voice remained quiet. "They already planned to." Dalton blinked. Victor continued. "You're expendable." Dalton's expression shifted from anger to realization. "They told you that?" Victor nodded. "They told me nothing." Matteo stepped forward slowly. "But we know how these things work." Dalton's grip on the gun weakened slightly. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Nina's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen Dalton afraid before. Victor spoke again. "Put the gun down." Dalton laughed nervously. "You think this ends with me going to jail?" Victor shook his head. "No." He nodded toward the street behind them. Police lights suddenly flashed at the end of the alley. Red and blue reflections danced across the brick walls. Dalton's face drained of color. "You called them?" Victor said nothing. Matteo answered instead. "Federal investigators." Dalton's shoulders dropped. The gun lowered slowly in his hand. "I was just doing what they told me," he muttered. Two police officers entered the alley cautiously. "Drop the weapon." Dalton let the gun fall to the ground. Within seconds, the officers had him in handcuffs. As they led him toward the patrol car, Dalton looked back once at Nina. "You should have kept your head down," he said bitterly. Then, he was gone. The alley fell quiet again. Nina stood there, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Victor turned toward her. "You're free now," he said. Nina looked confused. "My job is finished," Victor said. Matteo added gently, "So is the debt." Nina blinked. "What?" Victor reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper she had shown him the night before. The debt note. He handed it to her. Nina stared at it. The numbers suddenly looked smaller than they ever had. Victor nodded toward it. Some debts exist only because someone powerful says they do. Nina tore the paper slowly in half. The pieces fluttered into the trash bin beside the dumpster. For the first time in over a year, she felt something strange in her chest. Relief. Victor watched her quietly. "What will you do now?" he asked. Nina thought about the question. For months her life had been defined by shifts, deductions, and exhaustion. Now that weight was gone. "I guess," she said slowly, "I'll find a better job." Victor smiled slightly. "I know a few people who run restaurants." Nina laughed softly for the first time that night. "That might help." Matteo opened the car door again. Victor nodded toward the street. "Come on," he said. "We'll get you home." Nina looked once more at the restaurant behind her. For a year it had felt like a cage. Now it was just another building in Chicago. She stepped toward the car. As the sedan pulled away from the alley, the first light rain began to fall across the city. And for Nina Carter, the long debt that had once controlled her life was finally gone. The night had started with a question about a piece of paper, but it ended with something far more important. This story reminds us that injustice often hides in ordinary places. Sometimes it isn't violence or crime in the obvious sense, but quiet exploitation, people working hard while slowly being trapped by systems designed to keep them powerless. Nina's story shows that dignity matters, even in the smallest jobs, and that no one deserves to live under fear or endless debt. It also teaches that courage does not always appear loudly. Sometimes it begins with someone simply asking the right question and refusing to ignore what they see. In the end, justice often starts when one person decides that silence is no longer acceptable. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.